Hello friends, welcome to the series which we are doing on issues in world history 20th century, and in the earlier lectures on capitalist industrialization we talked about the various aspects which are associated with the capitalist industrialization and how over a period of time it was in a way referred to as the industrial revolution, which began in Britain and thereafter it spread to other countries, and the kind of debates which are there with regard to the historians and scientists, those social scientists, those who have talked about this capitalist industrialization and how various kinds of paths they have been followed with regard to industrialization. When we talk about the countries which were there in Western Europe, and these paths they have been different within the framework of Britain, France and Germany. And when one takes into account the kind of path which these countries took, we also have to take the historical and the geographical diversity of these regions and the kind of gestation period which they also took, these specific economies or countries. And when you see these kinds of variations which are there that in a way militate against non-country specific theory of capitalist industrialization, that we cannot be specific in that sense that how industrialization it began in this particular country, because largely it is being talked about that industrialization began in England, and the kind of situation or the factors which were responsible for the industrial revolution which began in Britain. And when you talk about the other economies, other countries of Europe in that sense, then we realize that France was not far behind in that sense, and industrialization could have taken place in earlier than Britain there as well. But the role of agricultural revolution, especially in Britain, was an important factor. And when you talk about the scholars like Patrick Bryan and Kegler Kader, they suggest that the British experience in initial rather than normal practice, especially with regard to relative size and the productivity of agriculture. And they argue that the economic theory lends no support to assumptions that there is one definable and optimal path to higher per capita incomes, and still less to implicit notion that this path can be identified with British industrialization as it proceeded from 1780 to 1914. So scholars they have their own arguments with regard to the British experience, and they see the initial experience as well as the kind of normal practices which were involved. And when they talk about especially Britain, they largely talk about the agricultural revolution in Britain, the kind of changes which came initially in the agricultural sector in Britain, and how this sector in a way supported the industrial revolution. And we find that first and the most famous instance of the economic growth when you talk within the framework of Britain and the British Industrial Revolution, it is not nowadays in the framework of some kind of a positive development, only because there is a lot of criticism with regard to the kind of changes which came in the British society, which were very restrictive, which were very exploitative for the people, those who were involved in the industrialization process. And we see that when you talk about the hardships of the people, those who were involved in the factories, and how the people, those who got exploited in these factories, especially women and children as well, apart from men, those who worked there for long hours, we find that scholars they have seen it as some kind of a painful process. And when you talk about industrial revolution, we find that over a period of time industrial revolution has both the positive as well as the negative aspects. And we also see when you talk about revolution, it is considered to be a sudden kind of an event, but industrial revolution in that sense took a lot of time from 1740s, 50s, and it has been argued by the scholars, and then continuing till the first phase. We find that it continues, and then the second phase where railways etc. they become more dominant in Britain. And the researchers, they have stressed the gradualness of the change which came over a period of time, when it is being seen from a macroeconomic standpoint, and has also been tending to argue that the industrial revolution, it was not merely economic in nature, but you have to also see the social, intellectual and the political aspects which are associated with the industrial revolution. And when you talk about the historiography which is there, in that sense, then how the national aggregates which are associated with the historiography, and the sectoral analysis to the regional variations which are also involved when you talk about industrial revolution, and the uneven development which took place in different regions of Europe at that point of time. And we find that some regions, they developed at a comparatively faster rate than the other regions, and this has also been in a way viewed and critiqued by the scholars. And when you talk about the social history, that how it has shifted away from the analysis of the new class formations and the consciousness as characterized by E.P. Thompson and emphasized by J. Foster, to identifying continuity between social protest and radicalism between 18th and 19th centuries. So, we find that when one is talking about the social history, and social history talks about the various aspects and the dimensions which are associated with regard to the class formations, or maybe the kind of consciousness which is there. And scholars, they have also talked about these kinds of aspect when they are dealing with these centuries. And we also see that some kind of a tendency in the socio-cultural historiography of the 1980s, and it is argued that the British industrial revolution was very incomplete, if it existed at all, because industrial bourgeois failed to gain political and economic ascendancy. So, it has also been argued by the scholars that British industrial revolution was not a complete process, if you call it industrial revolution in that sense, because there are divergent viewpoints that industrialization cannot be called as some kind of a revolution in that sense. And when you talk about the bourgeoisie of that particular region, we find that they were not able to secure the political and economic ascendancy at that point of time. And when you talk about the kind of wealth which was there with the landed element or the landed aristocracy, then we find that they have argued that it was largely in the hands of the political power or the economic power. It was not in the hands of the industrial bourgeoisie, but rather it was in the hands of the landed aristocracy. And we also see, when you see the social and the political life of the 19th century, and then the major division in this life, especially in Britain, is argued to have been that between the dominant gentlemanly capitalism of the aristocratic and the rentier classes, and subordinate industrial capitalism. So, scholars, they have tended to see that there were a lot of distinctions in that sense, and how the dominant gentlemanly capitalism of aristocratic elements, it was also there, and the rentier classes, they had a different kind of the capitalist tendencies. And when we talk about these kinds of aspects and these kinds of distinctions, then the scholars, they have their own divergent opinions about them. And we also have seen, when you talk about the historians and how they have tend to understood the industrial revolution in Britain, and how they have moved away from viewing the late 18th and the early 19th centuries, particularly the period from 1780 to 1815 as a unique turning point in economic and social development. So, we find that how changes they have also come over a period of time with regard to historiography, and these changes definitely which was seen that they were some kind of a major turning points initially. Now scholars are not seeing them as those particular period, especially this period is from 1780 to 1815, and we see that the scholars especially when they conduct their survey, when you take the instance of A.E. Musson's survey in the framework of the growth of the British industry, and how he has criticized what he regards as the general interpretation presented in most textbooks, namely that industrial revolution had taken place by 1850 and that factory system had triumphed. So, their views which are in a way trying to provide some kind of a critique that industrial revolution had taken place by 1850, that argument, and the victory of the factory system as well. And he talks about the extent to which the consumer goods industries, they remained the handicraft industries which were located in the small workshops, and the degree to which as shown in 1851 census, and the patterns of the employment and the occupational structure remained dominated by the traditional craftsmen, laborers and domestic servants, and it was a very slow rate at which factories spread and steam power was diffused. So, we have these kinds of arguments which are trying to negate the earlier opinion with regard to the development of the factories, and the scholars, they have in a way talked about such kind of concerns, especially A.E. Mussons had talked about, and that how the consumer goods industries they largely remained the handicraft industries. And he also has talked about the small workshops, and he has tried to communicate that the factories, they developed at a very comparatively slow rate. And he has also argued that there are good grounds for regarding a period 1850 to 1914 as that in which industrial revolution really occurred, and on a massive scale transforming the whole economy and society much more deeply than earlier changes had done. So, we find that when you talk about this kind of a period from 1850 to 1914, where much more changes happened during this time, and these changes were massive in nature, and apart from the changes which were coming in the agricultural, in the industrial revolution, we find that how changes in the technology also brought about a lot of changes in the society and economy as well. So, scholars, they have in a way challenged the broad view of the industrial revolution which has been expressed in T.S. Eston's memorable phrase, a wave of gadgets swept over England. So, Eston's idea, where he talks about that the gadgets, they swept the Europe at that point of time, and this kind of a view was widespread in 50s and 60s and 50s and 60s, and the critics of Aston, they see industrial revolution as a much narrower phenomena as a result of technical change, and in a few industries, most notably cotton and iron. And we find that when you talk about these kinds of ideas, where only gadgets, they were being talked about with regard to the industrial revolution, only technology was being talked about with regard to industrial revolution, we also have to see that how the other kinds of aspects, they were also very, very important with regard to the industrial revolution, where we find that these kind of changes came in the social, economic and cultural and political spheres as well. And when you talk about the studies which have been conducted since 1980s, we find that the studies of the industrial revolution, they have borne out its gradual pace of change. It was not all that sudden as has been talked about, rather the gradualness of the industrial revolution has been talked about, and some kind of statistics, they have also been provided, and which have been produced, which talked about, which illustrate the slow growth of the industrial output and the gross domestic product. So, these kind of statistics, they have also been given or provided, that how the industrial output was not all that great, and the growth of this industrial output was very less or gradual. And even the GDP, which has been talked about, that it was also not that high as has been talked about. And when you talk about productivity, it was also growing slowly at that point of time, and fixed capital proportions, saving and the investment patterns, they altered only gradually. So, the changes in all them, they also were not very sudden, that the savings and the investment patterns, they also changed or transformed very rapidly. It also did not happen. And when you talk about the standard of the living, the standard of living of the workers did not improve that suddenly, and we find that their personal consumption remained largely unaffected before 1830, and were certainly not squeezed. And the other scholars, those who have conducted their research on the industrial revolution, and they have talked about one of the researches by Williamson, Nick Hurley and Feinstein, has revealed the fact that the British passed through a turning point around 1820s. So, whether 1850s was a turning point or 1820s was a turning point, or that point came when the industrial revolution began in 1740s 50s. So, it is a matter of debate among the scholars, and we find that they have argued especially that the growth in the national income was much lower before than after that date, and there was a doubling in the growth rate of industrial production too after 1820s, as they have talked about. And Feinstein's estimates of the rate of capital formation shows that it drifts upwards from then, as does rate of capital accumulation and growth rate of capital invested per worker employed in the industry. So, we find that estimates with regard to these kinds of growth, especially Feinstein's, they have been given, and they show that how it was drifting upwards. And this kind of data with regard to the rate of capital accumulation or growth rate of the capital invested, all of them, they were going up, which was one of the signs or factors in that sense, where we see that the industrial revolution took place. And when you talk about the standard of living of the people, we find that how the adult male working class real wage failed to increase between 1755 and 1819. So, we find that the real wages, they did not increase from this period to this period, which is from 1755 to 1819, but from the period from 1819 to 1851, it rose at an annual rate of 1.85%, according to the estimates in 1983 by Lindert and Williamson. So, we find that when the real wages will not increase, then the standard of the living of the people, that will also not going to increase that way. And such kind of a data which talks about the rise in the real wages, then they provide these kinds of figures, where we can in a way talk about that when the real wages, they are increasing, then definitely the standard of living of the people is also going to increase as well. And when you talk about the nations, then we find that Britain and France, they were in a way neck to neck in the framework of the changes which were coming in the industrial sector, and how France also was one of the nations where the industrialization could have taken place even before Britain. But we find that largely scholars or maybe the literature, they talk about the backwardness or the retardation of the French economy. And when they try to in a way compare both Britain as well as France, generally they in a way argue that how the economic backwardness and other factors, the retardedness of the French economy was responsible for it not being a country where industrial revolution took place at the first place. And when you see the tendencies in the Anglo-American literature on the modern French economic growth, was to treat it in this context as well. So, this kind of a tendency to see French society in that sense, where we find that they were seen to be backward in nature when they were being compared to Britain, was one of the factors. And in what might be regarded as the founding account of their development, Sir John Clapham went so far as to muse that it might be said that France never went through an industrial revolution. So, people like John Clapham, they have in a way talked about that when they are in a way praising the British industrial revolution, and they are so critical of the French that they argue that in France they do not see any kind of industrial revolution. And when you talk about how the economic historians, they have been impressed as they have looked at 19th century France, and is one of the failures of the dramatic breakthrough to appear was the absence of a marked acceleration in growth. So, that is one aspect which is the economic thinkers and scholars they have tried to see. And when the recent researches they have been conducted and theoretical insights they have been given, they have shown that the earlier debates they were based on false premise. In fact, although the pattern of industrialization differed from that of Britain and early industrializers, outcome was not less efficient, and in terms of social welfare they have been more humane. So, we find that there is a lot of praise with regard to the industrialization which took place in France, and we find that they have in a way talked about the humane aspects of the French industrialization, and the British industrialization on that count was criticized by the scholars in that sense. And when you look at the patterns of the growth of successful late industrialization, it appears that the French pattern may have been more typical than British. And when you talk about France and the situation in France at that point of time, we find the two factors in the French situation account in large measure for its unjustified reputation for retardation, namely a dramatic fall in marital fertility, which reduced the growth rate of population to less than half that of other major nations, and scarcity and high cost of coal, which resulted in a lower output of heavy industries, iron and steel in particular, than in other large nations such as Britain and Germany. So, when we are trying to compare these nations, then when we see the situation in France is in that sense that how when you talk about the retardation was in the framework of the marital fertility which has been talked about, and because of which we find that the growth rate of population in France was less than half of the other nations, major nations in Western Europe. And we also see the kind of scarcity which is being talked about in France, and the cost of coal, which was again a factor because the coal was on a higher side, it was a high cost. And when and coal was one of the important fuels which was being used at that point of time. So, we will talk further about industrial revolution and capitalist industrialization in our next lecture. Thank you very much.